We'll begin in a few moments. We'll begin in 1 minute. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Jacobovics. I'm the Vice President for Policy Development at Enterprise Community Partners, an organization committed to making home and community places of pride, power, and belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. I'm very excited to have everyone joining us today for Advancing Opportunity Through Affordable Housing. Today's webinar on commuting to opportunity employment patterns of people living in high poverty neighborhoods. The Advancing Opportunity Through Affordable Housing is a collaboration between Enterprise Community Partners and the Housing Partnership Network, with substantial contributions from the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of California at Berkeley. Today's conversation features the release of the 4th paper in the series, written by Elizabeth Kneebone, who is the research director at the Terner Center. The paper examines where residents of high poverty neighborhoods find work and what their commuting patterns teach us about what must be done to address longstanding spatial and racial disparities in access to housing, jobs, and opportunity. I'm also pleased to welcome Shannon Ross, who's the Vice President for Policy at the Housing Partnership Network. And following Elizabeth's presentation of her new paper, Shannon and I will each share our thoughts about the findings and implications for public policies. Together, we'll explore the housing and jobs landscape and engage in discussion of solutions that address investment in high poverty places and their residents and increase access to low poverty, jobs-rich communities for people who would live closer to work if they were able. And we will have time afterwards, towards the end of the hour, to respond to any questions coming in from our audience. So please take advantage of the question box, the Q&A, to send questions to any or all of us. This is probably not your first Zoom webinar over the course of the last 15 months or so. So it should be self-evident, but please use the Q&A to send. You can select any one of us or all of us questions, and I will share them with the other panelists to help round out our interesting and timely conversation. And so with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Elizabeth to share her paper with us.
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction, for convening this series with HPN, and for convening the conversation today. And I appreciate all you tuning in to be a part of this conversation about this new paper and this research topic. As I share my screen here, this, as Andrew mentioned, the focus of this paper starts from honing in on high poverty neighborhoods. And the reason that we start with that focus especially as we're thinking about advancing opportunity and pathways to economic mobility, is that there is a wealth of evidence and deep research literature that shows us that living in a high poverty neighborhood brings its own barriers to mobility and to opportunity. So anyone living in poverty faces a host of challenges as they try to find a path out of poverty. There's a double burden that comes with living in a neighborhood, a surrounding context that itself is high in poverty. And that actually, those barriers and the negative impacts that can come from living in a high poverty neighborhood, from negative impacts on education outcomes, health outcomes, employment opportunities, those impact the poor individuals living in the people living in poverty in those neighborhoods, but also other residents themselves are impacted by those surrounding neighborhood conditions. So as we think about how do we forge more pathways to opportunity, starting with these neighborhoods is a particularly important focus, both within these neighborhoods and as we open up options for people who would want to move elsewhere to access opportunity. And we know that housing and local land use policies both shape that landscape, but the way that housing and jobs and that landscape intersects with each other really has an important role to play in creating those pathways of opportunities that we want to see available to more people and places. So to assess this landscape of housing and employment, this analysis pulls on a national data set that brings together a number of different data sources. We have tract level data from the American Community Survey that allows us to look at things like poverty, like demographics, housing characteristics. Also for housing characteristics, we bring in HUD data sets, like picture of subsidized households and the low-income housing tax credit database that HUD maintains that allow us to see how the subsidized landscape plays out across these neighborhoods. And then we also bring in the longitudinal employer household dynamics data set, which is a very rich, very fine-grained data source that lets us not just see where jobs are located and what kinds of jobs are located where, but it also shows us the origin destination of where workers live and where they commute to go to work. So with that data set, we apply in this analysis two particular lenses. The primary lens that we carry throughout is this focus on the poverty rate of the neighborhood. High poverty neighborhoods, again, that evidence base shows us that the negative impacts of concentrated poverty begin to emerge when a neighborhood has a poverty rate of 20% or higher. So that's the cutoff that we use to identify high poverty neighborhoods for this analysis. Moderate poverty tracks in this analysis are those with poverty rates between 10 and 20%. In 2017, that's the most recent year for which the data were available at the time of this analysis, the poverty rate was over just about 12%. So most of the neighborhoods in that category, the moderate poverty category, have above average poverty rates for that time period. Low poverty tracks are identified as those with single-digit poverty rates. We also know that the sort of density of a place impacts the proximity jobs, the lengths people might have to travel to get to work. So we also parse these tracks into different types of geographies, different types of communities to look at these trends for big cities, for their surrounding suburbs. And in those are areas we look at the 100 largest metro areas and make that division between city and suburbs. So cities are the first named city in the Metropolitan Statistical Area title, and any other city that's in the MSA name that has a population of 100,000 or more. And that's so that we're really pulling out the sort of core places around which these regional labor markets, these regional housing markets have really evolved and developed. Then for the remainder of the metropolitan statistical area outside of those cities, that's what we consider suburban for the context of this analysis. Smaller metropolitan areas are those, those distinctions, those demarcations between cities and suburbs tend to be less pronounced. So we treat those as their own category. And then we also look at rural communities, which are all the census tracts that are located outside of an official metropolitan statistical area. And those are sort of two ways that we cut the findings throughout this analysis. But to provide a bit of context about what is the starting point, what is the landscape of housing and employment as we apply these lenses, first of all, what we see is that using those sort of categories of poverty rates, more than 1 in 4 neighborhoods meets that high poverty designation. So about 28% of census tracts in the United States are considered high poverty in this analysis. On the other end of the spectrum, you have about 40% of neighborhoods that have single-digit poverty rates. When we look at owner households, the people the housing units where people have bought their homes, we see the distribution of that stock largely matches up with that distribution of neighborhoods, except if anything, it skews more towards the low poverty communities. So owner households are slightly overrepresented in low poverty communities and underrepresented in high poverty areas. The reverse is true for renter households. We see a much larger share of renter households located in high poverty neighborhoods and a lower than expected share that actually locate in low poverty neighborhoods. That only becomes more pronounced when we look at households with less means, the less resource households. So if you look at rental units that rent for less than $650 a month, that would roughly be affordable to a family of 4 living at the poverty line. You see that the majority of those rental units are located in high poverty neighborhoods. The same is true for subsidized households, low-income housing tax credit units, households that are using vouchers, public housing units, all skew heavily towards high poverty neighborhoods. So the rental landscape available with families earning low incomes is largely concentrated in these high poverty neighborhoods. But when we look at jobs, how do jobs map onto that landscape? Again, overall, we see it roughly conforms to the distribution. We have 40% of all jobs are located in low poverty tracts, about 28% in high poverty tracts. So that might be as expected, just given the general makeup of these neighborhoods. But what we see is the types of jobs really skews differently depending on what kind of neighborhood we're looking at. So in high poverty neighborhoods, the types of jobs in those neighborhoods skew heavily towards healthcare and social assistance. You will find a higher share of jobs in those neighborhoods in those industries as compared to a low poverty neighborhood. Public administration, educational services, all again are more represented in high poverty neighborhoods. For low poverty neighborhoods, almost every other industry is more represented there than in high poverty communities. And that's true, again, you see a heavily skewed towards professional, scientific, finance and insurance, sort of higher paid sectors that often require advanced credentials or educational attainment. But it's not just those jobs that skew heavily towards low poverty neighborhoods. You also see an overrepresentation of accommodation and food service, retail, other services like beauty salons and barbershops are all heavily skewed towards low poverty neighborhoods. These service sector, service-oriented jobs are more prevalent there than they are in the makeup of high poverty neighborhoods. So again, that starts to suggest that this uneven geography of housing and of jobs can create potential barriers in connecting residents of high poverty neighborhoods to employment opportunities and the types of pathways that might offer a pathway out of poverty. And we know that this has impacts in terms of race and ethnicity and equity concerns there as well. Sorry, my screen is frozen. I apologize. I'm going to try to stop sharing and restart. Bear with me, we'll pick up. Okay, sorry, appreciate your patience on that. Let's see if we can move forward once again. So, and this is just to show that not only do the makeup of jobs vary across different types of neighborhoods, but the types of workers in those jobs also skews differently. So when you look at the race and ethnicity of workers who hold jobs in low poverty tracks, you see a much higher share of that workforce is represented by Asian and non-Hispanic white employees, and less so by Black and Latinx workers. The reverse is true in high poverty neighborhoods, that a higher than average share of workers who hold jobs in those neighborhoods are workers of color, and particularly Black and Latinx workers. So again, we know that there are real connections, and the spatial inequities and imbalances often intersect and reinforce racial and ethnic imbalances and inequities. And so what does this look like for workers, for residents who live in high poverty neighborhoods? Where do they work? Where are they finding employment? How far do they have to travel to get there? Well, first off, I think a really important high level takeaway here is that a significant share of commutes every day start in high poverty neighborhoods. So of the more than 140 million jobs captured in this data set, about 1 in 5 begin in a high poverty neighborhood. And these high poverty neighborhoods aren't just confined to certain communities or certain types of geographies. They are present across the urban rural continuum. So a little over a third of these tracks in this analysis are located in major cities and our 100 largest metro areas, but you see 1 in 4 in suburban communities, 1 in 5 in small metro areas, and rural communities too, being home to these high poverty neighborhoods. And the commutes, the workers commuting to work from these neighborhoods conform largely to that distribution, if not slightly skewed towards suburban areas where these workers are starting from. And though the line we use to identify high poverty neighborhoods is 20%, on average, these neighborhoods have a poverty rate of 30%. And when you look at where workers are starting from compared to where they end up finding work or commuting for their jobs, it is really evident that most people are traveling to work in a place that has a lower poverty rate than where they live. And in fact, roughly a third of these workers are traveling to low poverty communities to find their work. And you see quite large gaps and disparities from where they're beginning and ending. 24 percentage points for a worker who lives in a high poverty neighborhood but commutes to a low poverty tract, 15 percentage points in the case of moderate poverty communities. So again, largely these workers have to travel or are traveling to lower poverty places to find employment. And the lower poverty the place they're finding their job, the farther they're having to travel to get there typically. So this shows you that a worker starting in a high poverty neighborhood but traveling to work in another high poverty neighborhood, their typical commute, the median commute distance, this is as the crow flies, the median commute distance is 5.7 miles. It's more than double that to get to a low poverty neighborhood. They're commuting 12.5 miles for the typical commute. Now, if you add that geography lens to this, what does this look like across city versus suburban, small metro, rural? The lower density the place a person is starting from, the further they have to travel, especially if they're trying to find work or going to work in a low poverty neighborhood, with a one-way commute in the rural context being close to 50 miles to get to their job. And interestingly, the jobs that most of these workers are traveling to, if you're going to work from a high poverty neighborhood in a low poverty area, those commutes are more likely to end in suburban communities. I mean, that's true in cities and suburbs where most commutes end in the suburbs if you're traveling from a high poverty to a low poverty place to find work. But it's also true in smaller metropolitan and rural communities, sort of showing where a lot of these lower wage, potentially, jobs are in service-oriented clustering, jobs are clustering across metropolitan areas. And the challenge, again, it's not just the jobs that are clustering potentially in uneven ways, it's also the housing opportunities that don't map evenly onto this landscape, as we saw in the beginning. That when you look at workers who are starting in a high poverty neighborhood, most of the housing in those neighborhoods on average is rental housing. But when they are traveling to work in other communities, particularly lower poverty communities, those communities are less likely to have rental options available. And that's especially pronounced in areas that have single-digit poverty rates. And not only is there less affordable or less rental housing to begin with available in these communities, the rents often tend to be much higher than the neighborhoods that these workers are starting in. And again, the most pronounced difference we see there is if you're starting from a high poverty neighborhood, you're commuting to work in a low poverty neighborhood, the difference in median gross rents in those neighborhoods on average is 44%. They tend to be that much higher in the lower poverty neighborhoods. In addition to having fewer rental options, the rental options tend to be more expensive. That's only compounded by the fact that subsidies are also less present in these lower poverty areas. So if you look at the average share of subsidies available in the origin tract, most workers are commuting to a place that has fewer subsidized options available, if any at all. And again, it is the most pronounced for workers who are traveling to these low poverty census tracts. Now, these trade-offs come with real costs. So it may be that people are driving further distances because where they live, they're able to find more affordable housing. But when you start to look at the costs of those commutes, the math does not always work out. This is just one rough estimate, one way to try and help show the balance and trade-offs that workers are often faced with when they're having to commute further distances to get to work. If you assume, like most commutes are happening by car, even for low income, low wage workers. So let's look at the Irs reimbursement rate. If you say that 53 cents per mile to account for wear and tear and gas in 2017. What that leaves aside is parking, tolls. Let's assume you don't have to pay any of that. You're just paying for the gas, insurance, wear and tear on your car, and you're traveling the typical commute distance for these different community types. That ends up eating up a lot of the savings you might be finding in the difference in typical rents paid in those places. So for cities and suburbs, it can, again, it's almost half the difference in cities. In suburbs, it's 80%. Quickly, for small metro and rural communities, you may be outstripping the savings you're getting in housing costs, strictly in the amount you have to pay to commute to get to work each day. This is assuming you're working, you're commuting 21 days a week both ways. So there are real costs that come with this. And that's even before we talk about the environmental impacts of these types of commutes over time, the foregone wages or other ability to be civically engaged in your community, the cost you might be paying in childcare. It's really quickly apparent that there are a lot of trade-offs that may be hidden or not readily apparent in just considering the difference in housing costs. And again, we know that these have not just implications in terms of the concentration of poverty or inequality by race and equitable access, by income. These also are deeply tied to racial and ethnic inequities as well. When we look on the whole about the makeup of origin and destination neighborhoods in terms of race and ethnicity, overall, it looks very similar. People live and work in places that have very similar sort of makeup on the whole. But that's very different for high poverty neighborhoods. The residents in these neighborhoods, the starting point of these commutes, are much more diverse racially and ethnically, and especially because so many of them are traveling to lower poverty places that skew wider, you see much bigger disparities in the racial and ethnic makeup of the communities in which they're finding work. And that's true across community types. Even in places like rural communities and smaller metropolitan areas that themselves tend to skew wider and have less racial and ethnic diversity, there are still disparities, and the disparities only become more pronounced as you get into major metro areas in the urban and suburban communities where workers may be able to afford to live as opposed to where they're traveling to find their jobs. Now, the finding of this analysis, I think if we think about how do we advance economic opportunity, how are we finding pathways out of poverty for these households, for these families, this type of context is really important because it helps us understand where we're starting from. How do we meet communities and residents where they are to forge better pathways and increase opportunities available to them? And to me, it really underscores the necessity, the importance of having a both and approach in our policy and practitioner responses. to these issues. And what I mean by both and is, one, it's about how do we better invest in these communities and their residents so we bring more opportunities to them where they live. If this is where the bulk of affordable rental housing is concentrated, how do we begin there with making sure that there are other opportunities available in these communities as well? That the housing that is there is safe, it's stable, it's high quality. So again, trying to understand that there are negative health impacts that can come from being in an area of concentrated poverty. How do we use housing as a way to create better health outcomes and the stability to plan and become equipped for upward mobility? That relates to the second point here about the importance of connecting more residents in these neighborhoods to the types of high quality supports that can help promote economic stability and upward mobility. Things like the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, the Jobs Plus pilots that we've seen, high functioning, high capacity, mission-driven housing organizations are often able to provide these sorts of resident services and connectivity that can really help stabilize economically vulnerable families. But it's also important with those wraparound supports that those resources exist in or near these communities. So making sure there's also the nonprofit infrastructure, the institutional capacity that can help support and provide those wraparound supports, but also the jobs themselves, that there are quality economic opportunities and pathways within these communities for the workers who live there to be able to find that upward mobility. At the same time, seeing the distances many people are traveling, where jobs are currently located, how do we help create more access to those communities? For people who want to live closer to where they work, how can we make sure housing and transportation policy as well are working together to close that distance and provide more access to places where there are rich with job opportunities? One is expanding tenant-based vouchers. You know, fewer than 1 in 4 households that are eligible for that subsidy currently receive it. So making sure more of the families who are eligible for that assistance are able to access it is a critical first step. But we also need to make sure that those vouchers can be used and in more neighborhoods, and especially closer to areas and in areas of higher opportunity. So that includes increasing their portability, making sure the counseling is there to help families see where the opportunities are and access more of these neighborhoods. It also means making sure the housing opportunities are in these neighborhoods. As we saw at the beginning, so many of these neighborhoods don't even have rental options to begin with, or rental options that would be affordable. So especially given fair market rent standards, how do we make sure that we're not only adapting those policies to the best and most effective execution, but also that there are more affordable rental options? I think there's a real opportunity right now as we're thinking about the infrastructure bills being discussed in Washington to think about how do we create more of that capacity, of that supply in these areas, including dealing with exclusionary practices in zoning and land use at the local level. And part of that gets to this last point. We really need a stronger regulatory and enforcement landscape, the structure, the framework that ensures that localities, that private market actors are being held accountable for their fair market obligations and for their obligations in helping to redress the economic and racial inequities that are so entrenched in the current landscape, and that this analysis really throws a sharp, harsh light on. So if we really want to make sure that more households and more households of color have access to a wider range of neighborhoods, it's really ensuring that there are both the carrots but also the sticks in place to make sure that other actors beyond the federal government are doing what they need to do to make that a reality. Again, I think that this is a very important time to be having this conversation, especially it was these same findings and I think takeaways held true even before COVID, but now coming out of this last year plus, where we know that these low-income residents in neighborhoods have been hit particularly hard, and that we have an opportunity with the investments being made in response to COVID and in the bills being discussed, as I said, around infrastructure. How do we make sure that we are using those resources and applying them in a both-and kind of way to target these workers in neighborhoods to truly advance more economic opportunity for more people and more places? With that, I want to say thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Shannon, want to welcome you again and invite you to share remarks and thoughts on this presentation and what it means for the policy moment that we find ourselves in.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you, Elizabeth, for that great presentation and all your research. I think you hit the nail on the head at the end of your presentation when you said that we know even more now how important this is after the last year or so we've been through, where we've seen high poverty neighborhoods hit particularly hard. And we know that commuting to work and where you work and if you can stay home and all of that just has such an interwoven effect with everything that we do in our society. So it's great to hear your research. As Andrew said at the beginning, I am the Vice President of Policy at the Housing Partnership Network. We are excited to work with Enterprise and the Terner Center on this series of research. And we're really looking forward to having this conversation today because we're in a wildly different political moment than we were when we started this exercise several years ago. So, the pandemic, which you've already noted, but also the change in leadership and the unprecedented levels of federal investment that we've seen in the COVID relief packages, I think has really set the table to where we see a possibility of federal-led investment to really start to right some of these inequities that Elizabeth so rightly pointed out. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we've already seen, which is, like I said, the COVID relief packages have started making a down payment on some of the policy suggestions Elizabeth noted. For example, it's not tenant-based vouchers, but we do have a widespread rental assistance, emergency rental assistance program, right? That's new that we're letting. We have, almost $50 billion invested to help people pay their rents that couldn't pay it, that rental assistance, in addition to emergency choice vouchers that have been allocated that I think we're showing the need and demonstrating how federal violence assistance programs could be used. There's also federal money for home dollars for homelessness, which we're excited to see how that's used. That's been allocated to the states, but the rules aren't out yet, which I think people on this call probably know. There are Cdfi funds, so special Cdfi funds to respond to the emergency, which I think really gets to what Elizabeth was saying about the need to build up the capacity of these neighborhoods, invest in neighborhoods of opportunity. Cdfis have a long history of being able to reach communities the traditional banking sector isn't able to reach, and we're excited to see the potential for those funds and how they can get out there that money and really start making down payments in some of these things. And then finally, I'd highlight in the COVID relief, the $350 billion in state and local COVID relief funds. We were really pleased at HPN to see the broad uses Treasury imagines for those funds. And we're working with our members and state and local partners to make sure that can be used to invest in the housing stock, but also other services that you need to make these make high poverty areas more thriving communities, broadband, things like that. We think that's really exciting moment. So I want to take a little bit of time to say how far we've come from when we had no federal investment before I get into the next big exciting thing, which is infrastructure. Infrastructure, obviously is the big topic in Washington right now. I think it's really exciting that how far we've gotten along in the proposals, both from the president, but also from Democrats in Congress, all of which include robust affordable housing and community development investments. And the Republican proposals do not include affordable housing, but do include things like broadband and other things that we recognize need to be investments in these communities. So I think that the conversation is really rich, and I think housing and community development is well positioned to be included in whatever bill form goes forward. Obviously, most people, myself included, think it's likely that it would be a reconciliation bill. So the fact that Democrats, who would be the only votes likely needed for those sorts of bills, are fully on board with the housing community development investment, I think is, like I said, a very exciting time to look at making actual federal moves on this. I think some things to highlight in the infrastructure proposals. I think the building and repairing the housing stock, making more affordable units in both opportunity neighborhoods. The Biden administration has a proposal to do more low housing tax credits in opportunity neighborhoods, but also to build and repair and preserve the housing stock in high poverty neighborhoods. I think that that's just as needed, either single family or multifamily. We have some exciting proposals on that. Like I said, the broadband. And then there's one other thing I want to highlight is the President's Community Revitalization Fund proposal, which is, I think, really getting at kind of the investing in neighborhoods and the enterprises that make a community thriving and whole. I think thinking outside the box about how can you make federal investments that really connect the housing with jobs and transportation and all the opportunity. And I think that, again, some of the CDFIs that are members of HPN and I know Enterprise have been thinking about ways to do that with kind of catalytic capital. So we're excited to see where all that can go. So like I said, we don't know yet, but and that's just the tip of the iceberg, but there's a ton of really exciting proposals out there. And we're talking large dollar investments, which we know we need if we're going to move it. Unfortunately, the one thing I will say on a slightly negative note is that the universal vouchers, if we go through reconciliation, is probably going to be harder to do. So I know that was a President Biden campaign position, and I think something that a lot of people have long supported, but hopefully we can get at that in different ways, get at the same kind of opportunity areas, housing opportunities, different ways. But I'm not optimistic about the universal housing vouchers in this Congress, but I'm optimistic about a lot of the other stuff. So that's kind of my initial overview. Andrew, I know you have thoughts as well.
Great. Thank you, Shan. That really helps kind of bring together between Elizabeth's presentation of the kind of where the world was, at least pre-COVID, and kind of the political circumstances we find ourselves in now. I just wanted to share a few thoughts as well, and then we'll kind of shift to a three-way conversation and then a larger conversation with the other participants. I mean, I think one of the things, Elizabeth, about the research that's really powerful is just the reminder of the degree to which kind of neighborhood context is not just about the housing stock, right? But it's also about where those jobs are. That affordable housing, right? We tend to think about like, well, what's the rent, right? But obviously the income component is the other part of that calculation. And the source of the income primarily, right, as you showed, right, the 30+ million jobs, commutes that start in high poverty places, right? Folks have jobs, but they don't pay wages that allow them to come out of poverty. And I think that kind of undergirds this whole research, right? And like the fact that the cost of moving someplace else, right, might be too prohibitive on one hand, or the housing stock isn't even there, right? That you noted in the paper, right, that a third of the rental stock in low poverty neighborhoods is rental, but it may be out of reach to folks who are making poverty wages, right? And so thinking about how do you expand housing in those communities is really important, but also can we raise the wages of folks who are not commuting as far, right? And I was also struck by the high number of high poverty to high poverty tract commutes that again speaks to the sort of the paucity of well-paying jobs in some of these communities, right? And so I may be coming from a place with a lot of poverty, but the only job I can find that's within a reasonable commute distance is in another low opportunity, high poverty community. And so the fact that you would have to travel twice as far and incur very substantial costs to get to a lower or even moderate poverty community, which, as you mentioned, starting off, right? Even the moderate poverty communities are places that have above average poverty rates, right? So really to kind of escape poverty, as it were, in your commute, right? You're really traveling more than twice as far as someone who's otherwise going to another high poverty tract. And so kind of overcoming that, right? You spoke to the local land use challenges, but the need to preserve the affordability of the stock that already exists in both places. And I think that on the voucher side, right, even if Shannon notes, right, we're unlikely to get to universal vouchers, but just making sure that the vouchers are usable, right? There are really outrageous numbers of vouchers that recycle through the system because the initial recipient can't find a place to use it, whether that's small area FMRs and adjusting fair market rents, whether it's moving landlords to a blanket obligation to eliminate source of income discrimination, or even just more incrementally just moving landlords to more broadly accepting vouchers, I think is really important. So thinking about kind of what that means for creating kind of these mixed income communities, and really the social benefits that accrue not only to the, the resident or to the neighborhood, but we sort of think about all of the lost opportunities that exist at the macro level, at the societal level of time, as you mentioned, sort of time spent in commute, the cost of those commutes, the environmental cost of those commutes, I think really weighs on us as we think about what the, the policy options are and ways in which we can move, at the local level, communities to increase the supply or open up opportunities to increase the supply. At the federal level, thinking about funding preservation, funding vouchers, funding housing credit production, and other opportunities, I think are really kind of the three pieces for me that on the policy front really start to tackle these inequities that exist when thinking about these really lengthy commutes that don't necessarily generate higher wages, right? That's really kind of the underlying piece. And so kind of to toss it out to both of you for consideration is, what do we think that the kind of post-COVID era that we're kind of rapidly entering into potentially, right? Thinking about, obviously a lot of uncertainty about vaccination rates and then, future waves. But the challenges that we've seen around filling jobs, right? There were lots of predictions about where, jobs were going to recover and, job growth that have necessarily materialized with some of the projections, but really just trying to understand, right, difficulty that employers are having filling jobs. It's about, well, if you paid higher wages and sort of improved working circumstances, you might be able to fill some of those. But do we know what that looks like in terms of the opportunities for folks to begin to sort of transition on one hand, and on the other hand, thinking about also the end of eviction moratoria and the like, and the real kind of challenge of dislocation on the other hand. So we're sort of at this sort of pivotal moment, right, where we've got potential opportunities on one hand and tremendous risk on the other hand. And do you think that we're kind of meeting the moment in terms of the policy options that are before us? And what do you think is really kind of the things that we should be most mindful of in advancing policies, and which policies do you think are the ones that most likely to kind of emerge intact, as it were, through the political process, really at the federal level? I think the challenges at the local level, which do impact, kind of what happens, are definitely critical. But just to get your thoughts about the kind of the moment that we find ourselves in and kind of the knife's edge that we're kind of balancing on.
I can start. I think, and you bring up two really good points. I think the first, the job market, I think, and the obvious, the wages, and I think, not being a labor policy person, like, it's been very interesting to me to watch how this has played out across the country differently, and really highlighted, much like the pandemic highlighted the need for safe, secure housing when we all had to stay at home. I think this is really highlighting the need for a look at our labor policies, right? That, like, you see resort towns that can't fill up because they can't get international workers to come over on visas, like things that you never thought about of how they interplay. And you are seeing natural pressure on wages that I think could play out interestingly in the policy. If, the sky doesn't fall when companies move to $15 an hour minimum wage, I think it'll help. It could, long-term help build support for that as a more national policy. I think that, so that's been kind of unexpected, but probably should have been expected with such a major disruption. So that I'm watching as an interested citizen and someone who cares about, anti-poverty work, but not something I have expertise on. The second part you have, I think, is also really critical, is that the government has tried, as I said, we have unprecedented amounts of federal dollars that have been allocated by Congress to fight the pandemic. And that's not only the public health part, but really the economic fallout. So the emergency rental assistance program, the state and local funds, all of that the goal was to make it so there's not a cliff, right? Make it so there's not an eviction. People aren't all of a sudden, millions of people aren't kicked out of their homes. And I think we're really in a process now of seeing if that can work, right? So seeing the limits of federal intervention. And anecdotally, we have some HPM members who are administering rental assistance programs on behalf of their state and local governments. And I think it's a different story depending on where you are. All of the kind of problems of federalism that we see before, where this money was sent out to states and localities to use, and some were higher capacity, had already been doing, like the state of Massachusetts has had rental assistance programs for many years. And so we're able to plug into that system, and obviously, had some problems getting started, but like we're ready to go. Whereas you send that money to somewhere like South Texas, where we have members that are working on this, and you're building an infrastructure from scratch, a rental assistance infrastructure from scratch. So I think that it's going to be really telling to see what happens when the moratorium is listed, if we were able as a collective to get the money out in time. And I think any lessons we learned from that, in fact, lessons we've already learned, we need to apply to infrastructure funds. So I think we're learning that, if you're sending money out through existing pipes, to use a metaphor, that they have capacity limits. So as much as we know there's the need, you can only get it out so quickly, right? So and we saw this with the PPP program, right? That Small Business Administration isn't used to doing that level of funding. So there were some hiccups getting it up and out. So I think as we prepare for infrastructure spending and the investment we all, I think, at least on this call, believe needs to be made in our physical infrastructure and housing communities in this country, we really need to be thoughtful about the time it's going to take to put it out, what kind of limits we put on it, what kind of flexibility we give places to use it. Because I think, you can have too much of a good thing if it's not thoughtful enough.
Yeah, I would just echo. I think I was thinking the exact same thing about the capacity issues, but also, Andrew, what you're pointing out, you need talk about both, and you need. We have a housing solution that in itself is very multifaceted, and it's going to require a lot of different levers to move, but in and of itself would not be sufficient, even if we did all of that right. If people aren't making enough money, you're never going to build all the way out of it, right? Like we definitely need more supply. We need preservation. We need it in the right places and accessible to more people. But people also need to be able to make money that will give them a living wage. And the interesting thing coming out of the pandemic, one of the things coming out of this is, I think we've actually seen with the aid that has been delivered, it has reduced hardship. We have evidence that this works, and even the ability, to give people more choices about, I can have the safety that I need to stay home and homeschool my kids, or to make my, family with pre-existing conditions safer. Those sorts of tools like that, I think we've got really good evidence of what works. We also see the immediate pushback that comes to try and claw some of that back. So I feel like I wonder, my wait and see is how much of this actually becomes a lasting thing, or is it a lesson we learn with each downturn? But what could we forge out of this to say maybe we should have a higher minimum wage that should gain support for just better wages and working conditions. And then, sorry, the other point about the capacity is also, we have all of this aid, and we know that it's going to ground in very uneven ways. And if we don't deal with that capacity issue, we still may miss the boat and see both spatial inequity grow, and then also, because we know the disproportionate impacts have been on lower income households and households of color. In some places, we just may see those disparities get worse, even at a time when we have these unprecedented resources to make it better. So that capacity piece, the role of CDFIs, of other intermediaries that can step in for low capacity jurisdictions, I think it's, or those without the political will to implement potentially on some of these things, is going to be really critical.
Great. Yeah. So we've got about 10 minutes left for kind of conversation with the audience as well. And folks have been happily chatting, asking questions in the Q&A. I would encourage folks to please continue to type in questions. We may not get to everything, but certainly encourage folks to ask questions. I've got sort of a couple that I'm going to sort of blend together, focused on attracting jobs and job creation in higher poverty areas. One of the questions, sort of this melange of different kind of threads here than pulling together. But one of the comments was remembering from the 1980s, the impact of deindustrialization on communities and plants closings, and so the loss of good paying jobs in low and moderate income neighborhoods. The questioner asked and sort of commented and wanted to get your thoughts on this. I think it's right, but I want to get your take. Is that there's also an opportunity now to reimagine neighborhoods as assets, to grow worker-owned businesses and rebuilding urban manufacturing to lift economic security as part of place-based community economic development. So I wanted to sort of pitch to both of you in terms of, Elizabeth, want you to comment a little bit on what that might mean in terms of, sort of greater access to more proximate jobs, right? We don't see a lot of in-tract commuting patterns, right? People then tend to cross over, what the implications might be for strengthening some of those places in terms of their job numbers. And Shannon, to you, really the question is, how do we ensure that the capital flows to support these nascent businesses and the role of CDFIs in particular, but other resources to ensure that the capital is available for these sort of localized businesses that might serve initially serve a small area, but grow wealth within communities and retaining that wealth in communities and what the implications are. So, Elizabeth.
Yeah, just to say, I absolutely agree. I think that is, and I think we see some of that percolating up now with some of the funds and strategies sort of trying to mitigate impacts of COVID, is growing that capacity and opportunities for that small business development and resources being cultivated within the community. I think it's also that key lesson of we've seen different passes at economic development before, and how do you grow this? The recognition I think that we have now, the importance of that being the locally driven and that capacity being locally led, and making sure that those investments actually redound to the community itself and guard against displacement, that making the community members themselves a key part of that strategy is essential.
Yeah, I agree, and Andrew, you said it well. I think that this is really where the CDFI industry, I think, is on the leading edge, although not the whole answer, but to really look at what are anchor institutions, like how do you fund schools or hospitals or things that can really, spawn a whole economic ecosystem around them in these communities, right? Like, how do you invest in those? How do you invest in employers and jobs that are going to stay? And I think, as Elizabeth just said, it's really important that those come from the communities, that the community is getting input, that it's not someone in Washington or in the state capitol being like, we're going to put this here, but that you have some ongoing dialogue. But I think the recognition that is a part of infrastructure, as I said, President Biden's plan has, and also that's crucial to righting some of these inequities, right? That like, you're not going to tackle inequality if you just build the houses or just do some other partial fixes. That it really needs to be a holistic system-wide approach. So like I said, it's an opportunity for me to plug CDFIs, but I really do think that they've been so on the cutting edge of this kind of community-based capital work that really that access to capital is such a critical part of it.
Great. I'm not seeing any more currently live questions. Certainly, we've got time for a few more folks who want to type some in. But one of the questions that came in advance is, we've seen a growing gulf between lower wage on-site work and higher wage telecommute eligible work during the pandemic, and wanted to know from the participants, how do we see those patterns playing out in terms of making it easier or harder to expand opportunities for creating equitable housing choice?
I worry. One thing I'll say is we've heard this narrative throughout telework, that's what it is. We've totally disrupted everything. And we know that that's largely not true, especially when we're talking about this class of workers in these neighborhoods. Like, the more than 90% of workers with a high school diploma or less still commute to work. Throughout the pandemic, we're still commuting to work. They couldn't telework, right? And even when you get to associate's degree or some college, it was less than 20% were actually teleworking. So the bulk, and bachelor's degree. So like the only group of workers where the majority were teleworking are people with a graduate degree or higher. So it's only one segment of the workforce where I think this became the norm. The thing is, it's enough of the workforce that I do think there have been some disruptions in areas where people have decamped to, like where they went to find housing in lower cost communities that may be it may actually be creating more challenges in some of these communities for lower wage workers, because their housing is getting more expensive. At the same time, we haven't really seen a correction downward from the places they're leaving, because a lot of these places were already supply constrained and high cost. So I want to be more hopeful. I think the challenge, though, is that the issues raised in this paper haven't gone away because of the pandemic, and in fact, in some cases, it may be harder for some communities. So I think that recognition as we're delivering aid and thinking about infrastructure investments and so on moving forward. That's the key. Of like, you have to be able to base this in the local market and even neighborhood or sub-regional conditions, because it's playing out differently in different places, and we're going to see pain points that are very locally driven, and opportunities as well that are very locally driven.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth nailed it. I know, again, from the experience of Housing Partnership Network members, this is something that individual organizations are dealing with, right? Even the bifurcation within your own staff, that, you know, people who were doing property maintenance or on site with residents had to commute during the whole pandemic, right? You need that position, whereas some of the more administrative staff and executive staff were able to telecommute. But what does that mean for work culture? What does that mean for inequities? And how do you write that now that we've shown that some people can telecommute, but also, you know, you have these kind of two worlds. So that's another going to be a fascinating thing to watch, even among within communities and within companies.
Yeah, and I think that you know, both of those are absolutely right. And I think the challenge is that particularly in low poverty communities, right, the pressure on land prices is increasing, even as sort of traditional locations for employment, you know, office cores, suburban office parks, et cetera, is potentially decreasing. But within that, so on one hand, you know, sort of lowering barriers to production, you know, through making greater density available and things like that at the local level, which we spend a lot of time thinking about at Enterprise. You know, what does it mean to unlock land? I know the Terner Center's done tremendous amounts of work on that as well. You know, that's a real challenge as land costs go up, and we know that, you know, at least momentarily, at least the, you know, cost of materials, there are supply chain issues, et cetera. So the production challenge at the moment is certainly going to be with us for some period of time. The flip side is that, you know, there may be some opportunities we've written about to unlock, you know, lower cost of, you know, underutilized office space and the like, either for conversion to affordable housing or to kind of incubate new jobs and things like that. And so, again, I think we kind of are very much on the sort of knife's edge, and there are both, you know, lots of opportunities before us, potentially with public support to move in the right direction. But we also may find ourselves unable to capture that opportunity, and potentially setting ourselves, if not further back, at least not really addressing the underlying challenges that have, you know, Elizabeth's paper highlight in terms of the inequities of commutation. And so with that, we've got a minute or two left. So I just want to thank Elizabeth for really all the tremendous work, both on the paper and for the presentation today. To Shannon for joining us in this conversation. I want to thank everybody else for joining us to listen and hopefully learn and come away inspired. And there was just one quick question: is, will the reposting of this recording? Yes, I believe that it is being recorded, and I believe we will be posting it to the Enterprise website. If you go in and search, it's sort of a long URL, but if you just search for advancing opportunity, advancing opportunity through affordable housing is probably the easiest way to come to the long website. Otherwise, it's got a bunch of hyphens. You will be able to both re-listen to this, to share the link with your friends, as well as find Elizabeth's new paper, as well as the previous papers in the series. And so with that, once again, I want to thank Shannon and Elizabeth. I want to thank Andrea Russell and Rachel Drew hidden on the back end, who also made this possible. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you very much.